You're a lowly kitchen servant in the opulent palace of Versailles, and the year is 1672. The marble floors gleam beneath your feet as you carry a silver tray through corridors lined with priceless tapestries. Suddenly, the sound of your footsteps echoes differently. You're no longer walking on marble, but on a massive chessboard painted in alternating squares of black and white. Guards appear from nowhere, seizing your arms and dragging you toward the center of this bizarre game board. Your heart pounds as you realize the horrifying truth. You're not just carrying pieces for a game, you are the piece. Welcome to the twisted world of Catherine de' Medici's most depraved successor, a queen whose name has been deliberately erased from most history books because her crimes were too disturbing for royal chroniclers to record. What you're about to discover isn't just another tale of aristocratic excess. It's the story of how absolute power can transform human beings into playthings, and how one woman's psychological darkness created a reign of terror that redefined the very concept of cruelty. Before we dive into these forgotten chambers of horror, if you're fascinated by the hidden truths of history that textbooks dare not tell, smash that like button and subscribe for more content that uncovers the darkest secrets of the past. Drop a comment below telling me which country you're watching from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these buried stories together, connected across continents by our shared hunger for truth. The woman at the center of our story was born into privilege, but privilege poisoned by centuries of inbreeding and political machination. Let's call her Queen Marguerite, though that wasn't her real name, which has been systematically scrubbed from official records by embarrassed historians. Born in 1643 to a minor French noble house, she possessed the kind of ethereal beauty that Renaissance painters spent lifetimes trying to capture. Golden hair that caught sunlight like spun silk, eyes the color of winter sky, and delicate features that seemed carved from the finest marble. But beneath that angelic exterior lurked something fundamentally broken. Palace physicians would later theorize that her condition stemmed from a childhood trauma so severe that her developing mind simply couldn't process it normally. At age 7, young Marguerite witnessed her older brother's execution for treason, not from a distance, but forced to watch from the front row as her father's political enemies made an example of her family. The executioner's axe fell 3 times before her brother's head finally separated from his shoulders. The crowd cheered with each failed blow while Marguerite stood frozen, her small hands gripping the wooden barrier as blood splattered across her pale blue dress. In that moment, something died inside her. The capacity for normal human empathy, replaced by a cold fascination with suffering that would define her entire existence. Her marriage at 16 was arranged to consolidate territories between 2 struggling noble houses. Her husband, Duke Philippe, was 20 years her senior and already showing signs of the mental instability that plagued European royalty. Their wedding night was a disaster that set the tone for everything that followed. Philippe, weakened by years of mercury treatments for various ailments, proved incapable of fulfilling his marital duties. But rather than showing disappointment or sadness, Marguerite displayed something far more disturbing: genuine amusement at her husband's humiliation. Palace servants whispered about the new duchess's strange habits from her earliest days as a married woman. She would spend hours in the castle's dungeon chambers, not out of morbid curiosity, but studying the mechanisms of torture devices with the focused attention of a scholar. She commissioned detailed drawings of medieval implements, had them recreated by the finest craftsmen, and tested their effectiveness on condemned prisoners with scientific precision. But it was the arrival of chess at court that truly unleashed Marguerite's darkest impulses. The game had recently been introduced from the Middle East, and European nobility had embraced it as the ultimate expression of strategic thinking. For most players, chess represented intellectual warfare, a bloodless battle of minds where victory came through superior planning and tactical execution. For Marguerite, chess became something else entirely, a blueprint for human manipulation on an unprecedented scale. The first hints of her twisted vision emerged during a seemingly innocent game with visiting diplomats from Spain. As she moved her pieces across the board, Marguerite began making casual observations about how much more interesting the game would be if the pieces could actually suffer. The Spanish ambassador laughed nervously, assuming she was making an abstract philosophical point about the nature of strategy and sacrifice. He had no idea she was describing her actual plans. Marguerite's transformation into a monster didn't happen overnight. Like many tyrants throughout history, she began with small cruelties, that tested the boundaries of acceptable behavior. A servant who spilled wine might be forced to crawl across the dining hall on hands and knees. A guard who fell asleep at his post would be stripped naked and made to stand in the courtyard during winter storms. But these punishments, while humiliating, were still within the realm of normal aristocratic discipline. What made them different was Marguerite's obvious pleasure in witnessing the degradation. Palace staff noticed that she would position herself to get the best view of each punishment, her eyes bright with an excitement that seemed almost sexual in its intensity. The real warning signs began appearing when Marguerite started categorizing her servants according to chess pieces. She would walk through the castle corridors pointing at different staff members and announcing their roles in her imaginary game. "You're a pawn," she would tell a kitchen maid. "You're a rook," she'd inform a stable boy. Initially, everyone assumed this was just an eccentric hobby of their increasingly strange mistress. They couldn't have been more wrong. Marguerite's husband Philippe, meanwhile, was descending into the kind of madness that made him an ideal partner for her developing psychosis. His mercury treatments had progressed to the point where he experienced hallucinations, violent mood swings, and periods of complete catatonia. Rather than seeking medical help for her spouse, Marguerite encouraged his deterioration, feeding him stronger doses of mercury-based medicines and introducing him to exotic drugs brought back by explorers from the New World. A drugged, insane husband was a useful husband, one who would sign any document, approve any expenditure, and, most importantly, never question his wife's increasingly bizarre requests for funding and materials. When Marguerite asked for a team of craftsmen to construct something she called the Great Board, Philippe nodded absently and authorized the expense without asking what it was for. The construction project took nearly 6 months and required the complete renovation of the castle's largest ballroom. Workers were sworn to secrecy under pain of death, and many of them never lived to see the project's completion. Convenient accidents befell those who asked too many questions or seemed too curious about the Duchess's plans. What they were building was a chessboard unlike anything the world had ever seen. Each square measured 15 feet across, creating a massive playing field that dominated the entire ballroom. The alternating black and white squares were painted with special pigments that would show bloodstains clearly, though the workers didn't know that particular detail when they applied the final coats. Around the perimeter of this giant board, Marguerite had platforms constructed at varying heights, creating an amphitheater where observers could watch the games from different angles. The highest platform, positioned directly behind what would become the White King's starting position, featured an ornate throne carved from black marble and upholstered in red velvet that had been specially treated to resist staining. But the most disturbing feature of Marguerite's chessboard wasn't the scale or the viewing platforms, it was the series of holding cells constructed beneath the floor, accessible through hidden trapdoors in each square. These underground chambers were just large enough to contain a crouching human being, with iron grates that allowed air to flow through while keeping the occupants securely imprisoned. As the construction neared completion, Marguerite began the final phase of her preparation, selecting her human pieces. This process revealed the full extent of her methodical madness as she approached the task with the same careful consideration that a master craftsman might give to choosing the finest materials for a priceless work of art. The selection criteria were based on a twisted combination of physical characteristics, personality traits, and what Marguerite called entertainment value. For pawns, she chose young servants who were quick on their feet, but small enough to be easily overpowered if they tried to resist. Rooks required larger, stronger individuals who could intimidate other pieces through their physical presence alone. Bishops were selected for their intelligence and ability to understand complex instructions, while knights needed to possess both physical agility and the kind of desperate loyalty that could be bought through threats against their families. The king and queen pieces required special consideration. These roles would be filled by individuals whose suffering would provide Marguerite with the maximum possible entertainment. For the White King, she chose her own husband, Philippe, whose drug-addled state made him perfect for a piece that needed to move slowly and appear vulnerable. The White Queen would be played by Philippe's sister, a proud woman whose aristocratic dignity would make her humiliation all the more delicious to witness. The black pieces presented different opportunities for cruelty. The Black King would be a captured enemy general whose execution had been postponed specifically for this purpose, while the Black Queen would be played by a former lady-in-waiting who had dared to criticize Marguerite's behavior in a private letter to her family. As word of the Duchess's project began to spread through underground networks of palace gossip, a few brave souls attempted to warn the outside world about what was happening. Letters were smuggled out describing the construction, the selection process, and rumors about what Marguerite intended to do with her human chess set. But these warnings fell on deaf ears. The recipients, mostly minor nobles and distant relatives, dismissed the reports as exaggerated gossip or the fantasies of over-imaginative servants. The idea that a member of the aristocracy would actually use human beings as chess pieces seemed too outrageous to believe. They were about to learn that reality can be far more horrifying than imagination. The first game was scheduled for the autumn equinox of 1673, timed to coincide with the harvest moon when Marguerite believed the celestial alignment would amplify what she called the spiritual energy of conquest. Invitations were sent to select members of European nobility, each one carefully worded to suggest an innovative form of entertainment, without revealing the true nature of what they would witness. The guests who arrived at the castle that October evening represented some of the most powerful families in France, Spain, and the German states. They came expecting an elaborate theatrical performance or perhaps an unusual feast designed to showcase their hostess's creativity and wealth. What they found instead would haunt their nightmares for the remainder of their lives. As the aristocratic audience took their seats on the elevated platform surrounding the giant chessboard, servants distributed goblets of wine that had been specially prepared with mild sedatives. Marguerite wanted her guests relaxed and compliant, less likely to object when they realized what they were actually witnessing. The drug was subtle enough to pass unnoticed, but strong enough to dull moral objections and create a dreamlike atmosphere where reality seemed negotiable. Marguerite herself appeared as the evening's master of ceremonies, dressed in a gown of deep purple silk that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Her hair was arranged in an elaborate style that incorporated actual chess pieces made from ivory and obsidian, creating a crown-like effect that proclaimed her absolute authority over the proceedings. Around her neck hung a pendant featuring a miniature chessboard where tiny rubies and sapphires represented the pieces, each one stained with what appeared to be dried blood. The human pieces were brought onto the board through a series of underground tunnels that connected to the holding cells beneath each square. They emerged through trapdoors like actors in some hellish theatrical production, blinking in the torchlight as they took their assigned positions. Each person wore costumes that identified their chess piece roles: pawns in simple gray tunics, rooks in black leather armor, bishops in mock religious robes that had been deliberately torn and stained to show disrespect for sacred authority. What struck the observing nobles most forcefully wasn't the elaborate costumes or the scale of the production, but the expressions on the faces of the human pieces themselves. These weren't willing participants in some elaborate pageant. They were terrified prisoners who understood exactly what fate awaited them. The pawns, mostly teenagers selected from the servant population, stood with the rigid posture of soldiers facing execution. The more valuable pieces carried themselves with desperate dignity, knowing that their elevated status in the game meant nothing beyond prolonged suffering. Queen Marguerite's reign of terror lasted only 3 more years before her own madness consumed her completely, but the psychological scars she left behind echoed through European nobility for generations. Her story stands as a chilling reminder that absolute power, when wielded by a broken mind, can transform even the most civilized society into a theater of unimaginable cruelty. The chess pieces may have been human, but the real game was always about one woman's twisted need to prove that she alone held the power of life and death over everyone around her.